And so when you unpack that garbage can that is the demonic, you've got really quite an interesting index of the kind of things that people are afraid of at different times, the things which are causing them to lose sleep.
Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcasts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're looking into one of history's most enduring and complex figures, the devil. This is a topic that connects intimately with our ongoing exploration of witch hunts, as beliefs about Satan played a central role in many witch persecution narratives.
To help us unravel the fascinating history of the devil, we're joined by Dr. Richard Raiswell, professor of history at the University of Prince Edward Island and expert in medieval devil lore. Dr. Raiswell brings years of scholarly research to our discussion, including his work on forthcoming Routledge History of the Devil.
As we'll discover, much of what we think we know about the devil isn't actually found in biblical texts, but emerged through centuries of theological interpretation and cultural evolution.
From ancient monasteries to modern political rhetoric, we'll trace how Satan has remained a powerful symbol in Western culture, serving as what Dr. Raiswell describes as the garbage can of Western history, a repository for society's evolving fears and anxieties.
We cover a lot of ground today, everything from the devil's supposed involvement with witches to his place in modern political discourse. It's an episode you won't want to miss, so sit back, relax, and prepare to have your mind expanded as we uncover the devil's complex, multifaceted origins with Richard Raiswell. Thank you for coming on Witch Hunt Podcast. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your expertise and work.
So my name is Richard Raiswell. I'm a professor at the University of Prince Edward Island, off in Eastern Canada. I work largely on aspects to do with the history of the devil. I have translated and edited with a colleague, David Winter, a collection of primary source documents on the Middle Ages. I'm one of the editors with David Winter again and Michelle Brock of the forthcoming Routledge History of the Devil, which should be out in May, I believe. And I've done various articles and other books on devil-related themes and issues. So I'm really glad that you're coming around to talking about the devil. It's really exciting. I mean, underneath so much of the Western conception of witchcraft is the devil. And if these witches are going to be anything more than what Reginald Scott describes as sort of these weather-beaten old crones who are just sort of deluded, you need the devil underneath all of that. So the devil's sort of underneath a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about over the last couple of years. So it's great to be here and to actually bring some devils to this conversation.
Well, it's wonderful that you are here. We're so thrilled to begin this look into the devil, and this will be just our first episode on him. So, why is the devil so resilient?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, really, because we've had the scientific revolution, we've had the Enlightenment. The devil is sort of the epitome of this sort of anti-intellectualism. You would have thought the sort of the light of reason would have exposed the devil and just he would slowly have evaporated away and people wouldn't talk about him anymore. And in fact, that used to be the argument. There's a quartet of books done by the great historian Jeffrey Burton Russell, which was done in the 80s. Very fine collection of books. But one of the things Russell does is he sort of says after the Enlightenment, really the devil isn't much of a problem. I mean, yeah, there's some people at the lower end of society who started to talk about him, but that's just not true. He lingers on in sort of popular Christianity, but he's been very much part of contemporary discourse, particularly in the United States since World War II. The idea of communism, godless communism. In the end, who's the opposite of God? If you're not godly, what are you? Godless communism. You've got the sort of debate about removing prayers from schools. If you take God out of the schools, what's going to move into that vacuum? You've got the growth of new religious movements, neo-paganism, Wicca, then the Church of Satan in 1966. And you've got sort of the crisis in the family, which sort of results in the satanic panics of the 80s. that you talked about with Scott Culpepper just a couple of weeks ago. And you just had to watch your recent election campaign to sort of see the way the devil is deployed in political rhetoric these days. After the attempted shooting of Trump, it was just before the Republican convention, wasn't it? One of the senators said that the devil came down to Pennsylvania today and tried to shoot the presidential candidate. Very much part of political discourse. So your question then is a really important one. Why is he still here? Why is he so resilient? Part of the reason for that, of course, is that he's woven integrally into Christian belief structures. But that said, most of what people believe about the devil isn't biblical, right? The word communist isn't in the Bible. Jesus does advocate wealth redistribution in some level, but Billy Graham labeled communism as demonic. And in fact, in the wake of these sorts of arguments, you had "In God We Trust" printed on your money, i.e., we're not godless communists. We're not on the side of demons. The Bible takes no position on most of the hot button issues in the contemporary culture wars. It has nothing to say about transsexuality, drug use, evolution, psychoanalysis, all of these things. The Bible doesn't mention them. It's nothing to say about black metal, Ouija boards, the occult, Dungeons and Dragons, these sorts of things. It does, interestingly, have a bit to say about astrology, but it quite likes astrology, right? The three wise men, led by a star, they're astrologers. They're able to use astrology to work out the birth of the Christ child and to find him. And if you ask many people to describe something like the Black Mass, it's not in the Bible, but people would happily describe elements of it or what they think to be elements of it. So much of what we take to be demonic isn't biblical per se. So the issue is, where does it come from? And that's an interesting question. We're going to spend some time unpacking it. But at this point, I just like to say that if you do look at this kind of things which are labeled as demonic, if you take them apart and open up this big folder of the demonic and think about what's there, it's pretty ridiculous. Heretics, AIDS, witches, the EU, Jews, Freemasons, trans folk, black metal enthusiasts, Scientologists, New Age religious practitioners, the International Monetary Fund, spiritualists, aggressive women, the United Nations, homosexuals, Elvis Presley, tarot cards. Put them all on the table, and you've got things which have nothing in common, right? There's absolutely nothing that links them beyond the fact that over time, over history, somebody somewhere has labeled them as demonic, right? In that sense, the demonic functions as like the garbage can of Western history. It's where you put your fears, your anxieties, the things that are causing you a bit of angst and worry. And the demonic is just a fairly easy receptacle for them, in the same way that your kitchen garbage can has all sorts of different sorts of stuff. Rotting vegetables, well, they should probably go in your compost. But you've got all sorts of odds and ends which have nothing in common with each other beyond the fact that you've decided to get rid of them. So the devil functions a lot like that. So the devil is very practical in that sense of the term. And so I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind. He's resilient because people find a use for him. And that use changes over time. And so when you unpack that garbage can that is the demonic, you've got really quite an interesting index of the kind of things that people are afraid of at different times, the things which are causing them to lose sleep.
How has that usefulness of the devil, what uses has he been put to over time?
So all sorts of different uses. So is a way of thinking about difference, right? One of the things that the gospel says is that what agreement is there between Christ and Belial, which suggests that there is no sort of middle ground, no sort of common ground. So is a way of sort of dealing with difference, right? We don't need to come up with some sort of accommodation with Roman religious tradition. And we'll probably unpack this in more detail down the road. And we don't need to think about in too much detail magic or about heresy or something like that. We don't need to think about them in that much detail. We can just sort of demonize them. And then that's enough to explain them. Because when you say something is demonic, Scientology is demonic, what you're doing is linking them together with all these other things which are demonic. And it's all just part of the same story. The devil has many, many different tricks. And in the end, they're all the same. And do you really need to know any more than that? So it's a really useful way of dealing with difference. It's a really useful way of dealing with forces which are potentially destabilizing, like progressive forces, feminism, or the civil rights movement, or something in the course of US history. The civil rights movement suggests that America was founded on an original sin, right? It wasn't this sort of paradise in the woods, as it were. There is a deep original sin in there. And coming to terms with that is awkward and is difficult. Equally, feminism seeks to destabilize patriarchal, masculine, biblical masculinity, to use some of the sort of phrases. And so it's a challenge. So just demonize it, it's destabilizing, and we can get rid of it. We don't need to deal with it. It's up there with Roman idolatry, feminism, Roman idolatry. Again, they've got nothing in common beyond the fact that people at different times have labeled them as demonic. So I think that's quite a useful way of thinking about some of these things.
Thank you for opening up the discussion, talking about the demonization in our world. What is the backstory to the devil?
Yeah, this is really interesting. It's really contrived. It's really complicated, and it doesn't really have an awful lot directly to do with the devil. The story most people know, Lucifer is a puffed up angel, puffed up with pride, rebels against God, and his rebellion is unsuccessful. And so he gets cast down to earth, maybe into the pit as well. That's not in the Bible. I mean, there's no narrative in the Bible for that. The story that Satan took on the form of a snake, entered the Garden of Eden, and tempted Eve. Yeah, that's not actually what the Bible says either. So, what does the Bible actually tell us about the devil? Well, what I'm going to do now is give you sort of a greatest hits. Now, I don't have every biblical verse to hand, and you don't have 3 hours for this podcast. So, we just go with some of the greatest hits. So if you turn to the Gospels in the New Testament, the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, they all record early on the story of Christ going into the wilderness where he's tempted by the devil. And at one point, the devil says to Christ, I will show you, he shows Christ all the kingdoms in the world, and he says, I will give you all the power over these kingdoms. Christ, of course, says, no, I'm not having it. But this is the story of Christ's temptation, very famous, but it's more interesting for what it doesn't say in many respects. Because Christ does not say, devil, these kingdoms are not yours. He doesn't say, devil, you're lying to me. Christ accepts the devil at face value. This is an offer. This is a genuine offer, and I'm refusing it. In fact, it needs to be a genuine offer, because if it's not a genuine offer, Christ hasn't actually refused anything. He hasn't really been tempted, right? So it's got to be a genuine offer. So the devil has that power, and Christ doesn't deny it. So he doesn't do anything about that. And then he also does nothing about the devil. He doesn't, the story doesn't conclude with Christ beating up the devil or expelling the devil out of the wilderness or off earth or anything like that. He doesn't do anything about it. So that's quite interesting. There's a couple of problems there right away, but this is the first gospel story which deals with the devil. The Gospel of John has quite a lot more to say about the devil. John 8:44 famously says that the devil was a murderer from the beginning and that he is a liar. Well, okay, Christ in the wilderness story didn't say that the devil was a liar. In fact, he seems to have accepted the devil was telling the truth. Okay, so that's problematic. But the devil was a murderer from the beginning. Okay, who did he kill? Because that's news to us. Who did he kill? And the beginning of what? The beginning of creation? Okay, flip back to your Old Testament. When was the devil created? I mean, we've got Genesis 1, which details the creation story, and there is no story in there about the creation of the devil. It's just not there. Some of these lines from the Gospel of John are problematic. Who did he kill, and when did he kill it? And why are we only finding out about this now? We've got the Old Testament, and it's 4 times the length of the New Testament, and just doesn't mention it. But if we turn to the letters of St. Paul to the Corinthians, there's a section in the First Corinthians where Paul is complaining to the community of Corinth about fornicators in their presence. But what he says about the fornicators is interesting because he says that the community should deliver the fornicators to Satan for the destruction of the flesh so that their spirit may be saved. It suggests actually that the role of Satan here is to punish fornicators, to punish their bodies so that their spirits may be saved. That in the end, Satan is fulfilling the role of a parent disciplining a bad child. You don't call the parent disciplining the child, if the discipline is within reason, an evil parent. It's something which is necessary for the child's development in the same way that it's necessary for the fornicators to be disciplined so that they can be saved. Again, that's problematic. What do we do with that story? Finally, there's the book of Revelations in the Bible, and this describes the great war in heaven between forces led by the archangel Michael and an army which is led by what Revelations described as the old serpent, who is called the devil and Satan. So this is important because it suggests that the devil and Satan are the same thing, and maybe that the snake in Genesis is also the same thing. That's useful. It's the last book of the Bible, right? We've read the whole thing up to this point, and now finally we're told all of these characters are the same thing. That's handy. But the problem with Revelations is it's a book of prophecy. This hasn't happened yet. This war in heaven hasn't happened yet. In fact, it happens at the end of time, and the situation becomes so bad that Christ has to come back and sort everything out. It's a prelude to the end times. So that story about the great war in heaven coming from the rebellion hasn't happened yet. So the New Testament stuff is confusing. So let's turn to the Old Testament. There is a character who looks through the Old Testament called Satan, or as Satan. Does this clarify things? Well, not really. The most important book in this respect is the book of Job. This is the story of how Satan tests Job, a very pious worshiper of God. Satan is described as destroying all of Job's property, killing his livestock, killing all of his children, destroying his house, inflicting Job with all sorts of painful sores across his body. It goes on and on and on. So far, so evil. But it's the beginning of that book which is so interesting and strange, because we're told that Satan is in heaven, that he is talking to God in heaven, and he's giving God advice in heaven. He says, God, you might want to test this guy, Job, because you've given him everything. His life is wonderful. How deep is his conviction to worshiping you? And God says, you know what, Satan, that's not a bad idea. Go ahead and do it. So Satan is working for God, which is interesting. So if you're thinking historically, Satan is still in heaven at the time the book of Job is meant to have taken place. Which again is a problem. And then there's one more section in the Old Testament which is quite interesting. The beginning of Genesis 6. It's one of the strangest little texts in the Bible. It's just 4 lines. You got to put it in context. We've had the story of creation, the creation days, and then we've had the story of Adam and Eve, and the story of the temptation of Eve, the story of Cain and Abel. And then Genesis 5 is a long genealogy. And then suddenly out of nowhere, we've got this introduction to Genesis 6. And it begins by talking about a group called the Sons of God. Hang on. Who on earth are they? Where did they come from? And these sons of God, they mate with human women and have children with them. Oh, and then there's another throwaway line in passing. By the way, there were also giants on the earth in those days. And there's nothing else. After that, the story of Noah and the flood begins. And it begins by saying that God's so concerned about the level of evil across the whole world that he decides to destroy everybody except for Noah and his family and start again. So the sense is that this little 4 lines at the beginning of Genesis 6 is something which is linked to the flood story. But what? So this is a skeleton view of what the Bible sort of says about the devil and Satan, equating the two, reading backwards the Old Testament in the light of the New. But it raises an awful lot of more questions than it solves. When was the devil created? If he fell, when did he fall? Because he seems to still be in heaven in the time of the book of Job. So what's happening in the Garden of Eden, which presumably happened before the story of Job? And what's his role? He's working for God in the book of Job. He also seems to be working for God, or at least doing something godly, in Paul's letters to the Corinthians. So theologians in the early church trying to think about these sorts of things end up looking elsewhere to build a backstory. They realize that what they have to do is interpret this text. They can't take it literally because it doesn't work literally easily. They've got to read some of it metaphorically or allegorically. And that's not a problem for many of these people because Jesus spent a lot of his time talking in parables. They're clearly not meant to be read literally. And in fact, Christ says, I speak to you in parables sometimes because it makes you think. You've actually got to think about these things. So if Christ's talking in parables, why wouldn't you expect to find parables elsewhere in the text? So there are people who've been doing this for quite some time. There's a book attributed to an Old Testament patriarch called Enoch. Doesn't make it into the Old Testament, composed around about 170 BC. And it expands on that sons of God story. And here it makes clear that the sons of God are actually angels. And these angels lust after human women. and they rape them and they impregnate them. And these angels know that what they have done is wrong. So their leader gets them to take an oath that they won't rat each other out, that they'll stick together in all of this. And because they're angels, they know the secrets of God. And so they also know all of the secrets of the universe, all of the secret powers in the universe, things that we will later label as magic. And they teach them to these human women they have mated with. Obviously, God is rather annoyed at all of this. So the text has one of these angels cast into an opening made into the earth, and there he will not see the light until the coming of judgment, at which point he'll be cast into the fire. And the text then goes on to talk about these giants, who now are the children of these women and angels. And these giants are identified as evil spirits. And they reside on earth, and their job is to afflict, oppress, destroy, and do battle for the destruction of the earth. So we're getting somewhere there. But the leader of these angels isn't called Satan or Lucifer. He's called Semjaza. And the angel who's cast into the earth is Azrael. But we've got an origin story for magic as well. We've got the skeleton of what's going to become a fall story. We're not quite there yet, but we've got the skeleton of it beginning. And we've got an origin story for magic as well. And it's a lot like the story of Prometheus in Greek myths, stealing the secrets of God, as it were. A generation after the Book of Enoch is written, there's another one of these Old Testament apocryphal books circulating. And this is written between about 150 and 100 BC. It's the Book of Jubilees. And in many ways, it's an attempt to flesh out the story in Genesis. It begins by giving the creation story, but there are a few differences here. Jubilees makes clear for the first time that angels and all other types of spirits were created on the fourth creation day. It was the fourth thing God did, and that was create angels and spirits. And then it says that Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden for 7 years before the incident with the snake. We're getting a chronology here, and that's handy. And then it repeats the story of the angels lusting with women that comes from the Book of Enoch. But then it goes into the story of Noah and the flood. But after the flood, it gets a bit interesting again. God sent out the flood because human beings have become sinful. God wants to wipe them all out, start all over again. So the earth should have been purified as a result of this. But Jubilees picks up with Noah having a conversation with God. Noah's complaining to God about these things he calls unclean demons, who clearly haven't been destroyed by the flood. They still seem to be around. And these demons are a problem because they're leading all of his grandchildren astray. And it turns out, according to the Book of Jubilees, that these demons are actually the ghosts or the spirits of these giants from the Book of Enoch. And now Noah says to God, "Can you do something with these demons, please? They are annoying my family. They're leading my grandchildren astray. Can you do something with them? Can you confine them to a place of judgment?" he says. And God agrees. And at that point, the leader of these spirits come forward. His name is Mastema. And this Mastema says to God, "Can you leave some of these evil spirits free? Can you let some of these evil spirits be free and under my control? Let them roam around on the earth because human beings have the potential to go astray. And my job is to lead these people astray, to lead the faithless, to test the faithless, to test how deep their faith is. So God agrees to that. God agrees with Mastema to let him keep a tenth of all of these ghost, demon, giant thingies allowed to roam around on earth. And then Jubilees crucially says that Mastema may have a tenth of these demons so that they might be subject to Satan on the earth, which is sort of Mastema becoming Satan as the head of this force of demons which is roaming the earth doing destruction. So we still don't have a fall story yet. The fall story in the end is largely the work of two Christian theologians, a guy called Tertullian in the 2nd century and a guy called Origen in the 3rd century. Origen is from Alexandria, and he sets about thinking at one point about the various names and titles that are used to denote the devil in the Bible. There's devil, there's Satan, there's wicked one, there's enemy of God. There's also prince of the world. And that's what gets Origen interested. He says there are lots of princes of the world described in the Old Testament. And their power is described in the Old Testament as ultimately coming to nothing. There's the story of the Prince of Tyre in Ezekiel. The Prince of Tyre is enormously wealthy, very powerful, but he's exceptionally proud, incredibly arrogant. He even proclaims himself a god at one point. God declares that because of his arrogance, he will fall. And then there's the story of the king of Babylon in the book of Isaiah. Similar sorts of story. A proud ruler that God will cast down at some point down the road. Both of these stories are prophecies in the Old Testament. But there's a line in the story of the king of Babylon, which is quite suggestive to Origen. Because the prophecy says, after the king of Babylon has fallen, the Israelites are mocking him. They're saying, "How you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, who did rise in the morning. How you are fallen to earth, you who wounded nations." And so Origen argues that these stories need to be read allegorically. They're not about kings per se. They're actually allegorical tellings of the fall of an angel called Lucifer. And he says, if you look in the Gospel of Luke, Christ says at one point that he saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven. So this is where you've got the backstory of this proud angel falling from earth. It comes from the Enoch Jubilees tradition, sort of trying to expand on the idea of demons, developing the idea of demons, and then Satan from Mastema. But then Satan's read in on the basis of identification with Lucifer, read into the story of the Prince of Tyre and the King of Babylon. So it's not literally biblical, but that's how it develops over time. It's really quite a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see those things put together. So thank you for explaining that origin.
Pleasure. Yeah.
It sounds like there's multiple origins to Satan, that he's Mastema and he's Lucifer. Are those ever reconciled in any of the literature, or how does that get resolved?
Yeah, it just gets elided together into one big story. The story, by the time after Origin, nobody's really questioning that sort of backstory. But it's clearly something that people in the first couple of centuries of the Christian tradition are really trying very hard to explain. Because the Gospels, well, the New Testament is really contradictory about this. And it's obviously the kind of thing that people are very interested in thinking about. And you've got to consider that early Christianity like this, in this point, it's not a top-down Christianity. They'll read back and say, yeah, there is a pope, but you've got no network of communications beyond sort of letters crossing the Mediterranean, which are taking months at a time. No centralized authority, really. What's happening is that people are just asking their local bishop or whatever, okay, can you explain this to me? Can you explain that to me? And of course, the people in Corinth are getting different explanations to the people at the other end of the Christian world. You got lots of different sorts of traditions, but with Origin, you've got something which is becoming accepted as universal. I mean, there's all sorts of problems with Origin stories, but nevertheless, it becomes almost settled, and nobody's really disputing it after that much.
What powers did early Christians attribute to the devil, and what were the limitations on those?
This is really interesting and very important point. So you've got to think about things as divided. You got theologians at one point, very well educated men. They're all men, of course, and they're reading books. They're in the early church. They're reading works of Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy. Very learned men thinking about these problems from that angle. But you've got ordinary people as well who are illiterate. They know some of the basics of the faith, but they don't know much more than that. What they do know is that this world was apparently created perfectly, but my baby died last week unexpectedly. My crops are in danger of being wiped out by a freak weather event. Their experiences of misfortune in a perfect world are different to what's going on with the theologians. The theologians are very, very clear that the devil ultimately is a natural thing. What does that mean? Nature is the thing that God uses to order and control the universe. God created the universe, yes, absolutely. And then after that, he created this thing called nature, which is what causes things to behave pretty much regularly. The sun rises every day, not because God gets and moves the sun around, but because nature causes it to move that way. So nature is technically, it's the secondary cause. God is the primary cause. Nature is the secondary cause. It's a thing which God uses to control the universe. The theologians will argue that the devil is a natural thing. So what that means is he's not supernatural. The devil cannot do miracles. A miracle is something where God intervenes directly in nature to muck around with nature, to cause it to behave in a different, irregular way. God could, and he does in the Old Testament, stop the sun from moving, right? That's a miracle. And he starts it up again when it's convenient, when it's necessary. The devil doesn't have that kind of power. He has natural powers, but he is he's a spirit. So his powers are different from yours because he's got a different sort of body. We don't say that a dog has supernatural powers because it's got a sense of smell that's much better than ours. It's just how dogs are made. They are made with that ability. The devil, as a fallen angel, has some of those powers which are associated with him having the body of a spirit, an ethereal body, as you were. St. Augustine in the 5th century spent quite a lot of time thinking about this issue. He argues that we have flesh and blood bodies, so our motions are limited by our form, by our body. We can't move that fast. Demons, though, have ethereal bodies. So that means that they can move incredibly fast. Much of what you attribute to demons, or miraculous or semi-miraculous things that demons do, are actually a function of their nature. Demons can make things appear suddenly to you and me, and we are amazed and we are thinking that they are gods or something. But in actual fact, that's just because in the twinkling of an eye, a demon has gone from here off to pick up a bunch of stones from, I don't know, the Syrian desert, and brought them back here and stuck them on your desk. And he's done it in the fraction of an instant. From our perspective, it looks like a miracle. The devil has conjured stones out of nowhere. But from the demon's perspective, it's just how he's made, right? He can do that. So for St. Augustine, this goes a long way to explaining some of the things that demons can do. They're wholly natural, right? There's nothing unnatural about a demon doing this. Demons are also, because they can move so fast, they seem to be able to make prophecies or predictions that come true. But again, for St. Augustine, this is just a function of their nature, because what demons can do is they can flit across to your enemy next door, see that the enemy is gathering a massive army, come back to tell you, hey, by the way, I think you're going to be attacked in about 6 weeks. Sure enough, 6 weeks down the road, you're attacked. Aha, the demons are gods. No, it's just entirely because they can move so fast and see things that you can't see. The other thing Augustine says about demons is that they've been around since the beginning of time, pretty much. They were created at some point. And as a result, they've come to know the world in a way that we don't in our just 70, 80 years or whatever. So they understand how the world works in ways that we just don't. So they've got a long experience of nature. So they can see signs in the natural world. And they say, aha, when I see that, I know that this is what's going to happen. In the same way that a doctor can look at your symptoms and say, aha, in 2 weeks, this patient's probably going to be dead. They can predict the future that way. But the devil, when he's making predictions based upon his knowledge of nature, is not making secure predictions in the way that God would. These are just the devil's diagnosis on what's going to happen based upon his reading of these signs. Augustine, the theologians that come after him, are really quite happy with that. It keeps the devil confined within nature. The devil can't actually do anything miraculous. He can do lots of things that seem strange to us, but that's only because we're trapped here in flesh and blood, and we can't do very much. But the problem with this is that it doesn't actually do much for some of the more problematic aspects of people's beliefs. One of the thorniest questions is the extent to which the devil or demons can change people's shapes. There's a whole pile of folklore tradition here, which is Christians are encountering. Can the devil sort of transmute people into wolves? I mean, the Romans have got werewolf stories. Is that sort of thing possible? Later, during the witch hunting period, are they able to transmute people into the form of cats? Can they do that? Do they have this sort of power? Can the devil transform you into the form of a cat so you can get into your neighbor's house and spy around or whatever? Does the devil down the road have the power to create ointments that can cause witches to fly? Is that really something the devil can do? Is that sort of a natural thing and the devil's just got all sorts of natural knowledge and he knows how to make some sort of ointment which will cause broomsticks to fly with people on them? Or is this some sort of illusion be crafted? which is the devil is crafted in people's minds. But particularly when we get into the witch hunting period, these sorts of stories of transmutation, and many of the stories, we'll talk about the Sabbath down the road, but many of the stories associated with the Sabbath need to be true at some level. Because if they are just illusions, all you've actually got are a bunch of women who've been duped, right? And it's not a crime to be duped. You don't deserve to be executed to be duped. In fact, the passage in Exodus seems to suggest that there's something going on. Exodus 22:18, maleficos non perieris vivere. You shouldn't suffer a sorcerer to live. Incidentally, in the Latin, maleficos is masculine. It's in the Protestant translations when it becomes feminized as witch, but it would, wizard would be sort of, it's very definitely a masculine sort of noun, evildoer. But you need you need witches actually to be committing real affronts in order to justify the punishment in Exodus. Because if they were just being deceived, then you don't kill them. Obviously, God thinks there's something so incredibly offensive about these maleficos that they deserve to die, that they are actually working demonic magic, doing something supernatural would justify that. Just being duped by demonic illusions, well, yeah, that doesn't really deserve death. So there needs to be some sort of way of accommodating folklore, but also particularly when witches start confessing all sorts of odd things, a chunk of them need at least to be real. And some of the things which witches are described under leading questions and torture, which I'm sure you've talked about many, many times, some of the things witches are describing are unnatural, they're supernatural. That is, they're above the natural realm, and only God is meant to have that power above the natural realm. So they're actually performing evil miracles in some level. And when they confess to, well, there's a case which I wrote about where a woman is transmuted into the form of a cat, enters into the house of her son. She does horrifically his son, slits open a hole in his side, inserts a pile of mud and stuff in there. It miraculously seals up and then later explodes, and happily the son's saved. But nevertheless, she's arrested, she's interrogated, she's prosecuted, and she's executed for that. But that has to be real at some level to justify that. And I think that's quite an important point. So this sort of gets us into another area that's quite interesting. And that is the problem of experience. And how sort of people's experience of the world maps into their sort of ideas of the demonic. Early Christianity, if you think about it, it's underground in the Roman world. It's oppressed frequently. This is a secret sect, right? People are gathering in secret and taking the sacred meal together. And the danger is, periodically, they are persecuted. There's sporadic persecutions, and various Christians go off and at various times are martyred. So when Christians start thinking about the relationship with ancient Rome, it's a pretty easy one, that one. The Old Testament condemns idolatry. That's clear. It's in the Ten Commandments. And worshipping any god that isn't the true God is obviously a problem. It detracts from God's dignity. God doesn't appreciate that. The Ten Commandments clear. That shouldn't be tolerated. Roman religion, clearly idolatrous, right? We should have no sort of accommodation for Roman religion. Okay. So Roman religion, idolatry, it's right out, it's demonic, right? And in fact, the Romans are persecuting us, and members of our faith are dying for the truth. In other words, they're being killed by lies. And who's the source of lies? John was pretty clear about that. Demons or demonic. The relationship with magic is much more interesting and much more peculiar. You talked to Tabitha Stanmore earlier this year about service magic. And one of her points was that service magic persists because it fulfills a real social need. It's important. And as important in her period, 15th, 16th, 17th century, it's important in the ancient world as well. It's a way to try and exercise some sort of control in the world against life's trials and tribulations. It's a way of exercising control in the chaotic world. And all sorts of magical services are available across the ancient world. Love magic, Tabitha talked about love magic in the 16th, 17th century. Blessings, charms, cures for all sorts of diseases, good luck in business. And you've got an array of counter magic as well. The opposite, forms of curses. You can curse your business rivals. There's a famous curse tablet where some Roman brothel owner wants the prostitutes in a competitor's brothel to go mad. So he takes out a curse tablet. He pays for a curse to be made on these prostitutes so they'll go mad. And so he ends up getting all of the local business. Tabitha's point is that magic is basically useful. She called it service magic. People need to be able to expel disease, find thieves, protect the future, protect themselves against misfortune. But when Christ shows up, he's doing some of the same sort of thing. He's curing people of diseases. He's expelling diseases. He's using exorcisms to expel disease. He's expelling demons. He's bringing the dead back to life. He's doing all sorts of miracle workings. So one of the many problems confronting early Christians is, what do they do about this magical tradition? How do they distinguish their sort of set of wonder working, because it's passed on after Christ through things like holy water, the power of the cross, sacraments of baptism in particular? How do we sort of safeguard our wonder working and distinguish it from the wonder working of all of these competitors? And there's all sorts of competitors. It really is a marketplace in the ancient Roman world. One thing that Christians can't do is say that the wonder working of their competitors doesn't work. They can't just say, Roman magicians, they're all con men. Keep your money, folks. You can't do that because of a story in the book of Exodus. There's a story in the book of Exodus where Moses and his brother Aaron are confronted by Pharaoh and his magicians, and they get into a wonder-working contest. Pharaoh and his magicians turn their staffs into snakes. So Moses and his brother do the same sort of thing. This story goes on for a while. I don't need to repeat it. But in the end, the snakes he conjures end up eating Pharaoh's snakes, which is meant to take that their power is greater than the power of Pharaoh. But what the story doesn't say is that this stuff doesn't work. It does work. It does work. So that means that Roman magic can, at some level, work. What St. Augustine would say is, of course, all that's happened with Pharaoh's magicians is that demons have shown up. They've taken away the rods that Pharaoh's magicians have had, tossed them away, gone and got a couple of snakes, brought them back from Numidia or somewhere, brought them back, given them to Pharaoh's guys, and it all happened in an instant, and it looked like they'd conjured up these snakes. That's exactly what St. Augustine would say. So this magic works. The magic of the Romans works, but it's ultimately worked through commerce with demons, right? So what we're saying is that is magic. It does have powers, but it's dangerous magic. So be careful, or actually don't use it because it's really dangerous stuff. By contrast, our magic is the good stuff. Our magic is the legitimate stuff. And Christians go on to develop all sorts of wonder working tools, holy water, the cross, charms in the forms of blessings, invocations. There's little difference between an invocation and a prayer when you actually start reading these things, comparing invocations to demons to invocations to God. That interestingly, all set in the adjunctive. They're all actually orders. So you're ordering demons around, and you're also ordering God around. So what Christianity does with magic is it demonizes it literally. It says that it works, but it works through collars with demons, so it's dangerous. We've got the good stuff. So their experience with magic is to demonize it. So now we've got a new category of the demonic. We've got idolatry. We've got magic as well. But devil knowledge really gets another big boost from the lives of some of the early monks. In particular, you've got the life of Saint Anthony. He's the most important. Anthony his dates are absolutely amazing. He lives from 251 to 356. Yeah, 105 he lived. The story is classic. He gives up the family fortune and decides to go off to live in the desert as a hermit. Of course, Christ was, the story of Christ in the wilderness, he went off into the desert to be tempted by the devil. So Anthony's doing the same sort of thing. He's looking for demons in a way. And boy, does he find demons. He sets himself up in the desert and he's regularly beaten up by demons. They pound him, they smash him up. He's regularly in pain because he's been tormented by demons. But these demons also try to tempt him. They change forms, they create apparitions, they create illusions. They appear to him in the form of a woman, a black boy, a monk, various beasts. They even appear to him in the form of fire at one point. Now, the problem with this is Augustine has these demons as ethereal, able to flit around. So how does a spirit beat somebody up? The problem is you've got two quite contrasting ideas here. You've got Augustine and his nice packaged theology with demons who are just flitting around in the air. That's fine, that's great, they're all natural. But here you've got a demons, well, a host of them, who are physically powerful enough to beat up the saint. And what's important about Anthony's account is he doesn't explain it. Well, the author, the guy who writes it down, doesn't explain it. I'm not giving you any theology here. Readers, this is just what happened, right? The devil was able to do all of these things. I'm not going to try and explain it theologically. I mean, it doesn't work theologically, but I'm not going to try and explain it. So because of this sort of role of experience, the devil often takes on all of these new sorts of forms as a result of contact with other sort of cultures, other sort of traditions, other sorts of ways of living. And you don't have, the theology doesn't work, but it gets fitted in there, as it were.
How can attacks from the devil be viewed as evidence of the target's importance?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point as well. So the devil obviously doesn't need to attack people he's already got, right? They're quite happy to live in safety and security. They're already some of the devil's followers. So the devil attacks the most vulnerable, the weakest, in particular, women. The will of women is believed to be weaker. They're more prone to gossip and temptation as a result of that. Also, and this is a trope that you see all the way through this stuff, it's all in the witchcraft literature as well, female sexuality is never satisfied. So the womb, in the language of the time, the womb will do anything to see itself filled. So it means women are more likely to come to lust and all of the vices associated with that. So that's women are an easy target in that respect. That's why the devil, of course, attacked Eve and not Adam in the Garden of Eden. There's a really good story which circulates around in an apocryphal book of the Old Testament, where Eve's on her deathbed and she is really, really annoyed because the way she describes it, in the Garden of Eden, she and Adam are manning the defenses against Satan on the outside, and the angels are with them. Then at 4 o'clock or whatever, God demands the angels come and worship him. So the angels go off, leave Eve defending half the fort of the Garden of Eden by herself. The devil comes in. What's she going to do? Eve's really angry. Anyway, that's a different story for another day. It's a really good story, and it isn't talked about enough. Anyway, so the devil targets women disproportionately. He also, of course, targets anybody who's a soft target, anybody who's already particularly vulnerable because of gluttony or because of lechery or greed. If there's something there to exploit, he'll find a way to worm himself in. But he also is really repulsed by piety, by great piety. That's why he attacks Anthony. Anthony's being provocative. But there's a great set of stories associated with a monk from the 13th century, a guy called Recalmus of Schöntal. He writes a book called The Book of Revelations concerning the deceit and coming of demons against men. It's a very strange book. He's got lots of details about how demons have infiltrated into his monastery. He says demons are all over the place, like the spots in the sunlight. They are so common. They're all over the place. And sometimes these things combine to make human forms. They're always looking to entrap monks, he said, monks in particular. And they do it through tiny things as well. He says when he goes to do the monastic reading, so reading out loud to the congregation, sometimes demons know what the text is and they begin to say the words just before you do to make it sound like you're stuttering. I think it's quite clear that Recalmus actually has a stutter and he's just attributing it to demons. Later, he's talking and he seems to smell something really strange. And he says to the guy he's with, "Oh, did you smell that? Oh, that's demons." I think he's farting, right? And it's just written there in his book. But demons also manipulate people's faces. They twist their nose, they curl up their lip to make them look a bit ugly, to sort of God's perfect creation, making them look a bit nasty. And they fuss around trying to prevent monks from sleeping. And they also do all sorts of bigger things as well. They try to tempt monks by showing up in the form of naked women or taking on the bodies of dead people, all this sort of thing. And he hears demons talking to each other. Demons aren't actually that confident for Recalmus. They have to egg each other on. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. You can make his nose twist. Yes. And it's really quite a bizarre text. But the monastery is set up as a fortress. It's set up in the wilderness. And it's meant to be a fortress against the devil. In fact, Bernard de Clairvaux in the 12th century describes it as a fortress in militaristic terms. And the issue is you've got to clothe yourself in the armor of God to defend yourself from intrusions. But within the monastery, what do you do with people who might succumb to temptation? What do you do with them? This notion of a safe space, an enclosed space, comes from the monastery, but I think you still see echoes of it down the road. When you talk about the satanic pacts, as you did with Scott Culpeper, the suburb, the white enclave of the American suburb is that sort of safe space. I would argue, go so far as to argue that one of the subtexts of Christian nationalism and the idea of building a wall with Mexico, and presumably you'll have to do something about our Canadian border as well down the road. It's about creating another sort of safe, enclosed fortress space where you are immune from demonic incursions at some level.
Thank you so much. This has really been wonderful. I've learned so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Mary Bingham is back with Minute with Mary.
I listened to Richard Raiswell as he described how the devil is viewed by people in varying historical cultures from 1600 to 1650. According to Richard, the Puritans living in colonial Massachusetts would have viewed the deceitful beast of the New Testament with much power. You see, where there was good, there was evil. To believe in the existence of God, one also believed in the existence of the devil. And the scary thing for them is that the devil lurked everywhere, around every corner. This baleful beast was part of their invisible world who, they believed, could disguise himself as someone's likeness moving about and causing harm to that person's adversaries and their environments. Such was the case when two men accused Sarah Wilde's spirit of spooking their oxen, causing the beast to drive the cart straight down into the brook, throwing loads of hay into the water after a full day of mowing. This was also the case when Abigail Faulkner stood accused of witchcraft at the bar in the meeting house. As her accusers were flailing with fits, the magistrates demanded, and I quote, "Look at their distress." Abigail replied, "I do not afflict them. It is the devil who does it in my shape." Then there is John Proctor, who wanted to beat the devil out of the accusers. But that's another story for another time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
And now Sarah has End Witch Hunts news.
And Witch Hunts news. This January, as we recognize National Human Trafficking Prevention Month, let's discuss a critical but often overlooked aspect of trafficking: the exploitation of cultural beliefs and spiritual practices as tools of coercion. Traffickers don't just use physical force or financial control. They exploit deep cultural beliefs, including fears of curses or spiritual harm, to maintain power over victims. This psychological manipulation, combined with document confiscation, debt bondage, and isolation, creates complex chains of control that can be especially challenging for survivors to break. Strengthened prevention efforts must ensure culturally informed support services, recognize trafficking in all sectors from agriculture to hospitality, address increased digital recruitment through social media, and protect vulnerable populations through education and community support. If you or someone you know needs help, the National Human Traffic Hotline is 1-888-373-7888. Together we can build more effective, culturally sensitive approaches to prevention and survivor support. Join us on February 1st at 1 p.m. for Remembering the Innocent Victims of the Connecticut Witch Trials, a special 2-hour commemoration of those who lost their lives in colonial Connecticut's witch trials at Connecticut's Old State House in Hartford, Connecticut. Award-winning performers Deborah Walsh and Jenny Wolfe will open with a dramatic reading, followed by an expert panel featuring the Connecticut Witch Trials Exoneration Project founders, historian Richard Ross III, and Connecticut Representative Jane Garibay and Connecticut Senator Saud Anwar. The afternoon culminates in a walk of remembrance to the memorial bricks at the ancient burial ground, where author Richard Ross will share insights from his popular history walks and offer closing reflections. Connect with fellow community members as we work together to shine a light on this crucial chapter of our history. Don't miss this powerful blend of performance, education, and commemoration that aligns with Connecticut's recent legislative recognition of these historical injustices. Reserve your free ticket through our Eventbrite link.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us on Witch Hunt.
Spend time with us again next week.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.